back from Swedish Lapland through the Arctic Circle over 230 kilometres on what's really an expedition stroke ultramarathon. We were looking at approximately minus 50 when you include wind chill, sideways winds that were blasting us around about 50, 60 mile an hour and throwing up spin drifts and making it almost impossible to see more than maybe a metre, 2 metres in front of your face. So I think 8 people were rescued off the mountains. Couldn't see more than a metre with 15 metre way markers. So people were getting lost. Chris described it on the Omnia podcast as they found somebody running in circles screaming at one point. They had people have lost parts of the digits to frostbite. There's a chap got snow blindness. These conditions were extremely dangerous, and I then had the question of: Are you a fool? Are you being an idiot? Are you going to get to this, fail, relive all those negative emotions that go along with failing?
Jonathan Payne is in the building, and we spend a lot of time sat in these seats talking shenanigans and all things athletic performance. But today we're going to focus on his experience in the Arctic. So, Jonny, hello.
Hello.
Okay, good talk.
Yeah, and goodbye.
So
it's funny that you say we spend these times in these chairs. It's interesting that
I like flipping it this way, though.
Yeah, the immediate switch when you're now interviewing me as opposed to us working together to interview somebody puts my mind in a different place. It's interesting.
Omnia Performance Podcast last week, though, the Q&A format that we both did, I thought worked really well. But again, it kind of flipped that switch between interviewer and interviewee, which I quite enjoyed. So we'll do more of that. So at this point, it's worth signposting the Omnia Performance Podcast. If you haven't yet listened to that, it will be in the show notes. No, it's not going to be in the show notes down below, actually, but you'll know where to find it. Just go fish, yeah? Marco.
Polo.
Thank you. And why don't you just give us a bit... I can give an objective context, but I think given it was such a profoundly extreme experience, do you want to just give us a bit of a summary of what you've just been through?
Yeah. So I've just returned, I think this is week 2. I'm back from Swedish Lapland through the Arctic Circle over 230 kilometres on what's really an expedition stroke ultramarathon. So that's a 5-day event of 14-hour days, constantly moving through very, very extreme conditions. And actually probably one of the first formal events, barring supporting you and taking part as your support runner in certain things. Certainly one of the most, I think, in maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, Fergus, maybe 5 years, maybe 6. So it's been
It is 6. Yeah. Wow.
I mean, it's not like I've not been ticking over and doing things. I just haven't actually set particular goals for myself.
Aside from Project Vertical, which was 2020, but last
that was
solo
our
solo
event.
endeavor. Yeah.
This is signing up to something that somebody else is running and committing to a kind of a race format. I suppose is slightly different, but first time in a long time. And with that, as you said at the top of the show, came. I'll be honest, a lot more fear than I had expected. A lot more anxiousness and sort of, almost overwhelmed with it at certain points. The race itself, I don't know if you want me to give you a spoiler now as to how it went in terms of...
No, far away. Just any context to help people understand what it was and what you went through top line so we can unpack it.
Well, yeah, let's run through it then. So the 5 days, over 230 kilometres, day 1, 65 kilometres, day 2, 50 something, and then it broke down the rest of that.
There was another 62 or 60.
Yeah, they're big days. They're big days, and to put it in, to contextualise it even more, the terrain is as you would expect. Where sometimes you're in hip deep snow. We had to wear snowshoes, so you're moving a hell of a lot slower than if you were running. So you may think of those distances, between 40 and 65 kilometres each stage, as being, they're big. They're big by anybody's imagination. But you might think, well, that will take X amount of time. It's probably worth multiplying that by 2 or 3. Given the context of the weather and the extreme kind of nature of the terrain, etc. So it was a really, really tough endeavour, a really tough effort.
Weather bottomed out at -50.
Give or take. We're estimating that when we say it.
That was top of Mount Cabot, wasn't it? Yeah.
And only because there was no real way of measuring it. You're using the best gauge we had was actually a sort of retrospective report off one of the snowmobiles on the support team that told us what the temperature had been like at a certain point. But we were looking at approximately -50 when you include wind chill, and to use a very technical term, sideways winds. That were blasting us around about 50, 60 mile an hour and throwing up spin drifts and making it almost impossible to see more than maybe a metre, 2 metres in front of your face at certain points.
I think it's important to flag, because you're already doing it and will continue to do it, speak nonchalantly about this. And we just had Chris King on the Omni Performance podcast talking about exactly this. These are extreme races, and that isn't just a marketing term in this case. There is risk of death. During the event, there was a significant dropout rate. I think, was it 60% dropout rate in the end?
I want to guess about, I think somewhere between 30 and 40% of the starters finished. 60 to
70% dropout, yeah. Interesting glass half full versus glass half empty mentality from us both there. But
spoiler alert, I was a finisher, so I'm looking at it from who finished as opposed to who didn't. I suppose that's just a bit the lens I'm looking at it through.
Essentially, there was hypothermia, there was frostbite, there was snow blindness, there were people just losing their heads and sort of panicking a little bit, and these are all the risks that go with being in such an extreme environment. And I know we will default to talking about this quite objectively, which might be a little superficial in terms of the challenge and associated risk, but not danger necessarily, as Chris said, because the race organisers, as you've said, were fantastic. But there is danger, and that danger, as I said, not danger, that risk, that managed danger, as it were, manifests itself. Fucking hell. That risk manifested itself for you as fear, as it will have done for everybody else.
Absolutely,
but I think, given the nature of the conversation we had last time you're on, given the nature of it's been 6 years since you've done something out there, given the fact that you've been unfortunate in circumstances over the years with injuries, with things not going your way, with the external variables that go with big events, not necessarily going the way that you'd hoped. You felt under pressure going into this, didn't you?
Hugely, mate. I put myself under a lot of pressure. And we had sponsorship from brands externally, and we were talking about it very openly, as opposed to me I could have just said, listen, Fergus, I'm going to enter this event, quietly. I want to do something and just kind of chase my demons down a little bit. But we were very open about, and this is part of a year-long campaign to do 4 extreme events that we've been very open about doing. So it's out there as well. So I carried a little extra weight, I think, in terms of my own managing of external expectations. I think anybody that I spoke to who was part of that accountability network would have said, don't worry so much, Jonny, but that's not the way you look at it as an individual, is it? You know that you have committed to do something for people. So that weighed on me. But for the most part, it was a very personal journey, and the nature of that fear did overwhelm me at certain points. And you've alluded to it yourself, is that I had the previous event that I did 6 years before that. I think the last event that I tried or attended to was the Spine race, a kind of a sister race, if you like, or certainly linked in with Beyond the Ultimate. The directorship is linked. But a very well-known race across probably one of Britain's hardest races, maybe one of the world's hardest races, the Spine. I only got 50, maybe 60 miles into that race. Bad kit choices, and also I was carrying an injury from the very start that meant I was moving way slower than I could have.
Hypothermic in the end, weren't you?
I was hypothermic, yeah. And that marked the very end of maybe 3 years of DNFs, injuries, problems, long-standing injuries re-emerging, surgeries, etc. The list went on so long that when I finished the Spine, or when I was removed from the Spine with hypothermia, I'd almost decided that this must be the end for me. I can't keep banging my head against this wall or trying to get through these doors and just getting knockback after knockback. So to eventually get to a point, and it's worth saying, through a certain amount of inspiration in coaching you and doing the things we've done, is looking on and saying, I feel like there's part of me that can still attend to these things. I know that I'm physically capable of X, Y, and Z. So on paper, the metrics all say that I can do these things. So clearly the only thing stopping me is me. So pulling that trigger, saying, yeah, I'm going to do it, contacting Chris at Beyond the Ultimate, asking whether or not he would allow me to enter his races, it became the start of this journey that so far, I guess we're a quarter of the way through the year-long project, but certainly I'm past the Arctic as a journey, which has been, to your question, a journey through fear again.
So how has that manifested internally in your prep day-to-day life? For those that don't know, Jonny has 4 children and a wife to attend to, as well as being 50% of Omni Performance with myself, and training volume was on the up. You had pneumonia along the way.
I bloody did, yeah, over Christmas. Had
but it's fair to say that your training
3
volume...
weeks away from me, didn't it?
Yeah, you did. And some years off your
Some
life.
years off my life, yeah.
by the way you looked during that period. But your training volume increased, your commercial demands increased because you had to manage relationships and how certain things were going to happen logistically. There was kit to buy, there was all the stress of it compounding over time. And that, in terms of headspace, is very susceptible to creating a dark cloud of anxiety and concern, as I've experienced, especially ahead of the double. I feel like prep-wise and feeling, we can probably draw a lot of similarities between how we're feeling without actually having necessarily unpacked it side by side and almost compared, because I felt right up against it with the double, but it was made much worse by just the sheer magnitude of what was to come, which was always front of mind. So I can imagine you felt the same.
I think they're very similar. Having watched your journey through that and talked to you about the psychological aspects and helped you manage some of that as we went through it, you know, being something of a counsel for you through some harder parts, as is my role as a friend, more so than a coach. I would say that there's parallels to be drawn there. You've definitely been there. And then on top of that is also this kind of compounding idea in my head of, am I finished in this? Is this stupid? You know, and I guess that's a kind of I don't think it is quite imposter syndrome. It was just a fear of not being what I hope to be. So I'm asking questions of myself physically and psychologically that I previously, when I'd entered these things, even up to entering the spine, I felt confident that I could do it, that I had just had a bad run. But having knocked it all on the head and kind of really focused on the coaching for a long time, I'd almost got to a point where I'd unwittingly, perhaps, convinced myself that I was no longer predominantly an athlete and that I'd left those things behind. So then to commit to it, I then had the question of, are you a fool? You know, are you being an idiot? Are you going to get to this, fail, relive all those negative emotions that go along with failing, and there's lots to be learned from failure, as we know, but I didn't want to be in that same place again. So have I just set myself down the road for heartache one more time, and if so, why the hell have I done this? And that goes kind of an underlying noise in the background that as the event got closer and closer, and as you've described, there were other things that kind of became bigger and bigger. You know, the closer we got, the more the training is, the more things there are to manage, etc. Because it's a new experience in terms of the environment. There was kit that was new to me, so there was some learning to be done, etc., etc. But this noise in the background of this kind of negative self-reflection or negative "you can't do it" noise got louder and louder and louder until the night before the race. So already in the Arctic, I had a horrendous experience. The worst point of it was the night before.
Talk us through it, because I know how you've described this experience. It does sound horrible. It sounds like it sounds like a bad dream, but one that you lived. Yeah.
So a great thing I think that they do within these races is I'm framing it like this because I don't want this to seem at all like a criticism of Beyond the Ultimate. I think what they did was excellent, and I actually think it's been really positive for me. But the night before we set off on this Arctic crossing, we slept in teepees on ranger skin on the snow. That was it. There's no other, and it was very, very cold, as you would expect. I'm guessing -20, something like that. So very uncomfortable. You're in with strangers. So the practical problems are that the reindeer, if you haven't, created an entirely flat surface on the snow underneath your reindeer skin, then you're essentially sitting on a toboggan, which is just going to slide down, and mine did over and over. So I lay down, found a comfortable position, which was almost impossible in the first place. Drift off for 30 seconds and find myself with my feet and knees hanging out the arse end of the tent, so the teepee. So just in terms of, that was for me to manage. I just made sort of poor decisions where I put myself in the teepee. I couldn't change that because there was 8 other people in there, and I'd have to lift somebody and throw them out the road in order to get my own a better space, or just curry into an absolute stranger and make a better friend than they had expected. So I didn't choose to do that. But so the physical experience was quite horrible. But what I was talking to myself about, the way that I was interacting with my thoughts was as negative, I think, as I've ever been with myself. It was very unusual.
Why do you think it was so bad this time?
Because I knew what was coming the next day. And so I got to... this physical discomfort lent itself to this. I think had I been in a lovely, cozy bed and all the rest of it, I might have thought, well, it might not have borne out in quite the same manner. But because I was frustrated and uncomfortable, and to keep myself warm, I had to cocoon myself inside the sleeping bag, actually close it off right over the top of my head. And then I found myself, because I wasn't breathing very well, because I was anxious, I had to pop my head back out, and then my nose would freeze. And so it became this kind of cycle of claustrophobia and freezing, none of this, all of this is as uncomfortable as it sounds. And meanwhile, other people around me, the bastards, are just snoring and sleeping, having a great night. Oh, this is lovely. You bankers.
I'm a big toasty cinnamon bun.
So I was just having a bad time. And then because I was in this negative mindset, I was trying to find ways out of it, trying to talk, find positive ways to think, but couldn't. And the more frustrated I got, the more I kind of leaned into this notion that I couldn't possibly do this. This is stupid. I can't even fucking get to sleep in this bloody thing, If I can't even find myself a comfortable spot in the cold.
I can't even execute the basic human requirement of going to sleep.
Bloody right have I got to be here. And I got my shoes on. I'm not sure if I've told you this before or not, but I got my shoes on at one point, ostensibly to go for a piss outside, which is an uncomfortable experience in of itself in that environment. But really, I was really going to march the 2 or 3 miles in the direction I thought that the organisers were asleep in their lovely warm cabin, knock on the door and say, I've wasted everybody's time, I'll take the first bus home tomorrow, thanks very much. And I'd got to the point where I was stood outside in the freezing cold, doing my business with the express intention of then continuing on to knock on that door. I'd all but given up. And all that was a psychological torment that I'd placed myself under. So
that self-doubt that you were experiencing there, magnified. Is self-doubt something you experience on a day-to-day basis, or did everything compound and culminate in that moment of anxious stress?
I think the latter for the most part. I think, like anybody, you fluctuate between sort of confidence and positivity and negativity in day-to-day things. But for the most part, I think you'll agree I'm a renowned grouch, but at the same time, really a glass half full kind of guy. I can find the positives. I can adapt well to things and all the rest of it. So it'd be unusual for me, and it is unusual for me to find myself in a negative situation and not be able to even practically maneuver my way through that and say, okay, you were thinking this way because X, Y, and Z. You need to just consider these things and weigh the pros and cons, blah blah, whatever way I might want to work out. But I couldn't. It was really really hard. And in the end, what seemed to save me was, or change my mindset rather, was the fact that it was freezing cold and I didn't fancy a 2.5 hour walk to wherever this cabin may be and find myself in the wrong place. Going for a walk to knock on the door may have been a shit decision. So I realised that. And then I was angry with myself. Again, stood out in the cold. And actually the Northern Lights were out. They had been earlier on. Everybody had stood outside the teepees and had a look. And so I stood under this kind of neon green sky. And just had a moment where I had a kind of word with myself. I looked at my watch and realised we'd got like 2.5 hours now by this point. We'd been in that bloody place since 7:30. We'd got nearly 10 hours to sleep. And so I had 2 hours left. And had just been in this mindset for all that, for the best part of 7 or 8 hours. And I just kind of looked up at the sky, looked where I was, looked around. I was alone in the sense that, you know, nobody knew where I was, and I was out, everybody was asleep around me. And I thought, well, if you don't start it, then there's the failure. That, you know, you've manifest your own issue here. You know, if I've already given up 8 hours of sleep, then I might as well just think, fuck it, I can't get 2 more. It doesn't really matter. I'll just go back in there and try and chill out, do some box breathing, and just get to the start line. And then take one foot in front of another. And if I feel like after half an hour I can't go any further, that's a decision I make then. If I feel like I can after an hour, etc., etc. So. And
how did you feel once, or when, rather than combining them and saying whence, as I've just done? How did you feel when the start klaxon went, when kickoff occurred?
Actually, very different because I'd had that kind of. Crossing the Rubicon moment outside in the cold, made the decision that you will start the race. You a kind of I guess I did have that practical kind of consideration in my mind. I kind of thought, well, you're talking yourself out of this. Not all of this is real. You're right to be afraid. You're right to have concerns. They're natural. They're given, considering the past that you've had. But to not start is to not try, and to not try is you may as well not have gone through any of the prep, and you know you have it in you. And then the practical thoughts were during training. We knew the data said that I was more than capable of all these things. So the only things that might beat me would be the environment and or sort of just external factors that you can't factor in. Why not give them a chance? You know, there's no point in me talking myself out of something without letting it. You know, if I'm going to stand in the ring and take a few licks and then get knocked out by a bigger guy, it's probably better than to take those cracks in the head than to not even get in there and try. You know, I might get a lucky punch. So that's kind of what I thought I would do, is to see if I could get out there and get a lucky punch.
Did all the stress subside once you took that first step forwards? Because I vividly remember I've never been as stressed, stretched, limited, worn thin as I have been right up until putting my wetsuit on in the tent for the double brutal. That was the period of training and managing everything else to get to that start line was as stretched and limited as I've ever been, willingly. And the second I got in the water and started swimming, I was completely calm because we were here. I was here. This was it.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you feel the same?
Very much so, mate. There was a lovely. I know I've been swearing a lot on your podcast. I don't know if your listeners.
That's all right. It's rated as explicit.
Okay.
You might have it rated as extra explicit.
Extra explicit by the
Triple X.
Well, I had that
kind of a completely different thing. I regret saying that now. Never mind. Move on.
The start line, each side of the start line was a little fire, which was not really to keep us warm. I think just to sort of juxtapose the ice a little bit in our minds and say, look how cold it is out there. This fire will demonstrate exactly it. So, but it looked lovely and all the rest of it. And I remember standing around and looking around, and I actually said to a couple of other people that I'd chatted to the day before, a chap called Paddy said, "How are you feeling? You nervous, mate?" And he went, "Shit in it." And I thought, yeah, this particular chap was really
sounds about right.
Yeah, really experienced ultra runner. I think he came third in the race. Very impressive guy, and you know he was shitting it. You know, I don't know. I know he'd slept the night before because he's one of the snorers, but he was still very nervous. And I kind of thought to myself, well, probably everybody's nervous, so your nerves are okay. If you weren't nervous, you'd probably be dead. So nerves are good. And then I looked around and had that same kind of similar moment under the Northern Lights that I had again, and thought, I had a little word with myself really, and thought, you're a cheeky prick really to be here moaning to yourself about how tough it is. A, you haven't even started, and B, what a privilege to be where you are. You know, in the middle of the Arctic Circle, surrounded by people who I was going to share an experience with, surrounded by an excellent crew of support, really impressive bunch of people around me who were going to make sure I was safe, under the watchful eye of many people back home who loved me and who only wanted the best for me. And for the most part, those people actually didn't care whether I finished, they just cared whether I was safe, So,
and additionally, the pride that you have earned the right to feel by dealing with all of the things that got you to the position of standing there having those reflections as well.
Yeah, and that went through my head as well. It's like, you've got here, getting here was a journey in itself. Yeah, you've got yourself back to the start line after 6 years, after the fear, after the worry, after the injuries, after all the things in your head and all the things that really did happen. It's this is to toe the line is actually quite impressive. And then took that first step over the line, and as you've described, genuinely the first step, I kind of went, and then the first part of that race to the first checkpoint was a 12-kilometer. Essentially, the only thing that's like any other race is that first 12 kilometers, where it was along a road before you then turn right into the actual wilderness, and that's 12k. And I jogged, walked, and ran. Met a couple of people, befriended a lovely fellow called Jimmy, who he and I shared some excellent time together on the first day, and every experience of that day was positive. Even when it was hard to do, none of it felt negative, because I knew what I'd been through the night before, and I was really quite elated almost from that first step. That here I am. All you have to do is keep moving forward, and that was it. And it was really kind of emotionally wonderful for me, because I was moving through the Arctic, having planned to move through the Arctic, and like I said a moment ago, it was a privilege to be there. But it took a lot to get through that night.
Did that fluctuate as the remaining 5 days or 4.5 days from that point onwards unfolded? Was your resolve tested again, where the self-doubt crept in, or was it just discomfort that you found a way through?
For the most part, the latter. I think even so, we described it at the top of the podcast here a little bit, didn't we? Is that days 1 and 2 of this particular race are quite a lot of hills and a mountain, some undulation to say the least. And day 2 was a really harrowing day for some over Mount Cabla.
A lot of dropouts there, weren't there?
Yeah, there was. I think 8 people were rescued off the mountain. We were in the winds and the minus 50 degrees, give or take, and plus 50 mile an hour winds. Couldn't see more than a metre with 15-metre way markers, so people were getting lost. Chris described it on the Omnia podcast as they found somebody running in circles screaming at one point. They had people have lost parts of their digits to frostbite. There's a chap got snow blindness. These conditions were extremely dangerous and extremely difficult. I found a practical way to work through that by working with a guy. We made a kind of a bond and worked through that together, just in a practical sense. But actually, and this may seem strange to people when I'm discussing the what I've just said there, that those kind of physical interaction with the terrain and all the rest of it was quite so horrendous. But I never felt anywhere near as the self-doubt marching through that as I had done in that fucking teepee the night before.
Do you think you could have better managed the anxiety and stress that you felt the night before by maybe leaning on those around you a bit more in the run-up, or maybe anticipating things a little bit more ahead of time, asking questions, buddying up with people when you arrived, asking for a bit of help rather than looking after your own kit? Was there anything that you think you could have done differently that would have better managed that anxiousness?
No.
Nope.
Honestly, no. And all the things you said that I could have done there, I did do. And I buddied up. I spoke to people. I leaned on the organisers, who were very, very helpful beforehand to double check my kit for me. Is this right? Etc. Etc. I think one very small practical thing that I could have done which only experience has taught me would be to make sure that bloody ranger skin wasn't a flat surface. And I might have not had the physical discomfort that then forced me into this really
that was a
negative
spiral,
mindset.
wasn't it? Yeah.
It was, yeah. But I think, and going back to the kind of the themes of the first podcast that we did, I think that I needed that. It was horrible. It was a really, I can't, if I was more articulate, I'd be able to describe the nightmare that it felt like it was in that TV the night before. But I can't. I'm not articulate enough, clearly.
That big pause was exciting, but ultimately disappointing.
But I think I needed it. I think that there was something. I've taken a lot from that because I've talked about leaning into the fear and marinating in it and absorbing it, and growth is in that fear and all the rest of it. And not all of it has been from experience. I'm not kind of waxing lyrical about that. That has been the experience that I've had in the past, but never more so than that. Or maybe in different circumstances I've felt as overwhelmed by it. But that in of itself gave me something in that race that had I not had that experience the night before, I'm not sure, the night before Christmas, I'm not sure I would have enjoyed it in the way I did. I'm not sure I'd have been as comfortable.
Appreciative of the outcome.
Yeah, I needed to be kind of, I wish I had a better way to say this, but almost sort of reborn through that fear, pop out the other side the next morning and just go, it's not going to be as bad as that was, you know, and then every step that I took, almost literally through that race, every step that I took, my confidence grew. On day one, from an athletic perspective, I really sat on the brakes quite hard, concerned that I might blow up a little bit and hamper my progress, or maybe kind of burn myself out for further days. By day two, getting through what a lot of people couldn't get through grit, determination, physicality, and a practical approach. Going into day three, I knew I could complete it. And from day three into day four, I actually knew that retrospectively I could have gone faster, you know. And by the time I got into day five, you and I have talked about it privately and on another podcast, is that I was almost aggressively excited by what I could do, you know. And when I crossed the finish line, without meaning any disrespect to anybody else, I looked and felt good in terms of, you know, I could have gone again. And so that in itself lends itself back to that kind of fear being quite so important. Also tells me that I was wrong, clearly.
Well, that's the interesting point here.
I'm not sure I could have found the right. I'm not sure I could have found that confidence and found that ability to march through and been able to tell myself over and over, you know, the environment's not going to beat me. I was able to talk to myself in that sense. This isn't going to do you. You were going to do you. You know, and if I didn't beat me, you know, then I couldn't have beaten anything else. And having beaten me, having beaten that really negative kind of mindset, I felt like, and as I say, more and more as the race went on, I could probably do anything. And I've grown so much from it in terms of my own confidence. Not to a point of arrogance. I still think I'll be the next race will be in 12 weeks' time, and I expect to be nervous, but I don't expect to have to cross that particular chasm.
It's completely different challenge as well, isn't it?
It is very much so, but I expect to be very nervous, and I expect to go through a kind of a barrier.
But you've been exposed to that feeling. You've now managed to process it, come out the other side, and have confidence in your ability to overcome it, which I think is the key point here, because what you've described is no different to somebody prepping for their first half Ironman.
No.
Ironman, an awkward conversation with their boss, asking for a promotion, all of the time that we devote in our own minds to reflecting on hypothetical realities or catastrophizing on the reality of the here and now for what the future could potentially be in that hypothetical concept in your own head. And it sounds like you almost fell so far down the spiral of anxiousness and catastrophizing that you lost sight of all of the work that you've done, all of the prep that you've done, all of the confidence you've built to put yourself in that position in the first place. Because there's millions, billions, in fact, of people worldwide that weren't in that position, whether by means, access, or whatever. Obviously, I don't want to sound insensitive by saying that, because it was a privileged position to be in.
Very much so, yeah.
But there you were. And if you look at things objectively, it's fascinating how you'd done the work, You'd made it happen. You'd got there. You'd managed all you needed to manage. And here you were, I'm having a shit night's sleep. Let's see how tomorrow goes. But that's not how human beings process things, is it? So even for somebody who, Jonny Payne, tattooed hard man, outwardly presented, still suffers crippling self-doubt when it comes to executing on task, which makes it's just a very human emotion to experience. So it's great to hear that you overcame it and are thankful to have come out the other side, because I reflect on the most negative experiences of my life, and I don't say I'm fortunate to have gone through them, because obviously I wouldn't wish some experiences I've had on my worst enemy, but I'm content with the fact that they happened, and actually thankful for the fact that they've happened, because they underpin part of who I am today and the character traits that I have and the understanding that I have and the exposure to certain emotions and the internal workings of myself that allow me to make more informed decisions and understand myself better moving forwards.
Yeah.
And that all comes down to the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, it does, mate. And it comes down to, the deeper a chasm you find yourself in. Maybe this is not the way I wanted to go, but the harder the experience, if you can get through it, whether it's a mental experience or not, you then have the opposite kind of peak, don't you? If you travel down far enough off the top of a mountain into a deep valley below, and it gets very, very dark and difficult to manage, if you keep going, you're going to be coming up the other side, aren't you? And the perspective, having come up that other side from having gone through what was a real hardship, gives you brand new perspective on yourself and a brand new kind of opportunity to kind of manage those emotions in the future. And I do think that in those darkest moments, there is always a chink of light, and there's a glimpse of your weakest, most fearful self. But then within that, there's also a glimpse of what you could be and what you could do. And it's finding that moment, and we can all do it. It's finding that moment where you can turn that kind of thing around and say, okay, now we're going to march back up there. And, I came out of that renewed. I came out of that horrible thought process ready. As you said, when I took that first step, it all changed. And I'm thankful for it. I think it was a gift in a certain sense. I don't think I'd like to go and do it again. I'd like to go and do the Arctic again. I enjoyed that immensely once I was moving, but I don't think I'd like to experience that amount of personal anguish and self-doubt and fear. Not soon anyway. But I am glad I did.
If you had the opportunity to be in that situation again, how would you have managed your psychological state of mind better, knowing what you know now?
I don't honestly know. Knowing what I know now, I think I could have tried harder to lean into those practical considered things that you said about being, we can look at the practical data, look at the metrics, look at the fact that I've done the work, all the rest of it. Every kind of yardstick that we had in place, every measuring or every metric that we had pointed to the fact that I had not only had every right to be there, but I could probably do quite well. That didn't seem enough for me in my head. It was like, I was telling myself that was all wrong. I was like, I've just gotten away with it. You're full of shit, mate. You didn't, and I was remembering workouts that I hadn't completed. A time when I didn't hit the pacing that I wanted. No, but that, you remember that one?
Oh, I skipped that set of curls. Oh, no.
Exactly that. That's what's going to be the hard
Am I going to have the walking pole power required?
If I de-rig and then rig again, that's that one time the pack won't come back up because that didn't do that set of curls. So it's easy, even with all these positives, I was finding that little tiny negative, and that's the one I was latching onto. I think there's lessons to be learnt there for me to try and figure out why that was the most powerful thing. I think it's actually human nature to a certain degree to focus on the negative, to focus on the fear. I think if we always focused on the positive and looked at things through rose-tinted glasses, then the saber-toothed tiger would have gotten us all. So it's normal and it's natural to lean into that fear a little bit, which is why it's good, because then you can grow, then you can understand yourself, then you can understand where the limits are. I do think that from my own perspective, that deep into it was not a good place to be and could have done me some damage. If I had given up based on how I felt, if I had made that journey and knocked on the door in the cabin and said, I'm done, maybe they'd have talked me around. Great people could possibly have done that. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd just respected my decision. And I know I'd be in a very, very different place now, which would not be good for me. So I'm glad going through it, and I'm glad I came out the other side. But I don't fancy doing it again soon.
I'm not shocked, to be honest. But how has the experience and the reflections since influenced your perspective as a husband and a father?
That's a great question, because it's been an emotional process. I'm being more patient, I think. Well, I wonder if my wife will listen to this and say, "No, you're bloody not."
Oh, well, I'm not. I can't not send it to her now, can I? Specifically this section.
That
so
little clip.
You're on thin ice, but you
listen
spent
to
a lot of
this.
time on thick ice recently, so this will balance it
very
out.
good, very good.
Thank you.
No, I have done. Well, these great big events, you do.
By the way, being more patient doesn't mean you are patient.
No,
it means you're less impatient.
less
so I think you can dress it up that way.
That's
if
glass
you'd
half
like.
empty, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is that I have come back to my beautiful family after having gone through something very hard. The actual event itself was tough to do. They're very proud of me as well, which is nice to come back and feel like I've got a young girl and 3 young boys, and all of them you want to be some way positively inspiring to. Certainly give them a decent opportunity to look at things in a hopeful, positive manner. And I feel like I brought that home to a certain degree. I don't think they'd have been. They're perhaps too young, and they love their daddy enough to be not disappointed. They just wanted me home safe, so I wouldn't have been judged for any particular failure at home. But I'm glad to have brought home the win, so to speak. But from that particular immersion into fear, and then the same as I looked at the race from that point on, this is all a privilege, this is all a gift. That's kind of lingered in a nice way that I'm home. And I'm looking at what I have as being a privilege, much more so. Never ever took it for granted. I'm always hyper aware of what I've got, and we practically count blessings together as a family. But I've been taking little moments and stepping back and looking at everybody and thinking, how lucky I am, and I'm glad that I had that dip into that little dark sea in order to come home and reflect on it.
Fantastic. I don't really think I need to ask where people can find you, but for the sake of argument, because it's a tradition. In the pub. Oh, that's a good answer. There we go. Yes. I turned uncertainty into humour. Fantastic. Great to have you here, Jonny. Anyway, Jonathan Payne on all channels everywhere. I'll put links down below, but if you're listening to this podcast, I'd struggle to see how you haven't yet come across Jonny. But nonetheless, if you're new around here, welcome, and thank you for making it this far. Please do make sure to hit follow / subscribe. Do engage with the show's sponsors, as they very kindly support the show and are very value-driven in doing so, as they like to encourage positive conversations like this one, where we can unpack some things that are potentially a little bit more profound than normal day-to-day conversation would be. But I'm very excited that you and I, whether this was in a podcast setting or otherwise, would be happy having a conversation like this over a coffee or a beer.
Yeah, for sure. This isn't an unusual conversation for you and I don't think. But it's nice to have the opportunity to share it with people.
Indeed. So make sure to do all of the usual podcast admin-y stuff. And if you think there's any value in this episode and the insights that Jonny's given us that you might want to share with a friend, then please do so. As always, thank you for listening, and see you next time.